Fake HOA cops slammed 16-year-old Ethan Miller to the ground, right in his own neighborhood. Behind it all stood HOA President Roger Brandt, who had quietly hired unlicensed enforcers to intimidate residents. But Ethan's father, Jason, had one powerful tool they didn't expect: a rock-solid case built with the sheriff's office. And just wait until you see how this story took a public turn, and why justice, in the end, prevailed. Jason Miller had just clocked out after a grueling 10-hour shift in the trauma wing of the county hospital. For a man used to life-or-death decisions, stress was part of the uniform, but nothing prepared him for what came next. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he tossed his hospital badge onto the passenger seat. The caller ID showed Ethan, his 16-year-old son. Jason answered on instinct. "Dad?" The voice on the other end was raw, shaking. "They slammed me down. They said I was trespassing." Jason's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about? Where are you?" Ethan's words came in gasps. "Down by the clubhouse. Some HOA cops, I guess. They had badges, Dad. They grabbed me and Zach. I swear. I didn't do anything." Jason's knuckles went white around the steering wheel. HOA cops? There was no such thing. Not in their neighborhood, not in this state. But the HOA board had grown more aggressive lately, flexing power where it didn't belong. Jason had heard whispers about private enforcers, but most folks chalked it up to HOA scare tactics. Now his son was on the receiving end of something very real. "Stay on the line. Are you safe? Where are you now?" Jason asked, already starting the car. "I'm home," Ethan whispered. "Zach's mom drove us. I didn't know what to do." By the time Jason reached the house, the sight of his son stopped him cold. Ethan sat on the couch, eyes red, his knees scraped, and elbow bruised. His favorite bike lay in the garage with a bent frame. Jason crouched in front of him, voice low but steady. "Tell me exactly what happened." The words tumbled out. Ethan and his best friend Zach had been biking along the community lake path, same as they did every Saturday. Out of nowhere, 3 men in tactical-style clothing with private HOA enforcement patches appeared, flashing metal badges. They blocked the path and barked that the boys were trespassing on restricted HOA property. When Ethan asked what they meant, it was a public access path. One of the men grabbed his arm and shoved him to the ground. The others towered over Zach, warning them both to leave or face further action. Only after Ethan was helped to his feet by a passing neighbor did the men back off. Jason's jaw locked, his pulse hammered in his ears. "No law enforcement agency authorizes that," he said through clenched teeth, "and no HOA bylaw gives them the right to touch you. They're impersonators." Melissa, Jason's wife, had been standing silently behind him. Now her voice broke the tense air. "They laid hands on a child, on our child." Jason nodded grimly. "That ends now." A father's fury is a powerful thing. Not reckless rage, but a cold resolve that burns with purpose. Jason wasn't about to let this be swept under the HOA's growing shadow of control. Now they had crossed a line, and they had picked the wrong family. Ethan's injuries weren't life-threatening, but that wasn't the point. The boy who had once biked through the neighborhood with effortless joy now hesitated to even step outside. His bruises would fade, the loss of confidence cut deeper. Jason noticed the small changes first, the way Ethan flinched when the doorbell rang, the silence that had replaced his usual chatter about weekend plans. His bike stayed untouched in the garage, a bent reminder of that day by the lake. It broke Jason's heart, and it fueled something else inside him. No one had the right to do this to his son. Not in this community, not anywhere. The HOA president, Roger Brandt, had always been a polarizing figure. The man seemed to thrive on control, wielding HOA bylaws like weapons. Over the past year, tensions in the neighborhood had escalated. New rules, hefty fines, restrictions that stifled even the smallest freedoms. Jason had heard rumors, Roger hiring questionable security to patrol common areas, especially after residents began organizing against the latest wave of board decisions. But this, physically confronting teenagers under the guise of rule enforcement, this was beyond anything the community had imagined. Jason wasn't the kind of man to let injustice fester. Days after the incident, when the monthly HOA meeting convened, he was there, front row, Ethan's photo in hand. When the floor opened for questions, Jason rose. His voice was steady, but every word carried weight. My 16-year-old son was assaulted by individuals claiming to be HOA law enforcement, he began. I want to know who hired them and under what authority they acted. Roger Brandt leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. These were contracted officers, he replied coolly. Their job is to ensure community rules are followed. We stand by their actions. Jason's fists clenched at his sides. His voice dropped, every syllable sharp. They are not law enforcement. They had no legal right to detain anyone, especially not a child. A ripple moved through the room. Parents exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers grew. The tension was palpable. But as Jason scanned the faces, he saw it. Fear. No one else stood. No one else spoke. Roger shrugged, as if the matter were beneath further discussion. The gavel fell. The meeting moved on. Jason left the hall burning with helpless frustration. His son's world had been shattered, and the very people responsible seemed shielded by a wall of arrogance and apathy. Back home, Jason paced the living room. Melissa watched him in silence, then placed a gentle hand on his arm. Jason, she said softly, don't forget, you trained evidence handling for the sheriff's department for 6 years. You know how to build a case. He stopped, her words sinking in. A spark cut through the cloud of helplessness. She was right. He did know what to do. And now it was time to fight back. With facts, with proof, and with the law firmly on their side. Jason didn't waste a single minute. For the next 48 hours, the living room transformed into a quiet command center. His laptop, legal pads, and phone stayed within reach at all times. Melissa brewed coffee and kept him steady. This wasn't a sprint, it was a mission. First, he called Zach's parents. They had been shaken too. Zach hadn't slept well since the incident, but both parents agreed. Something had to be done. Zach's mom had already spoken to her son about every detail she could remember from the drive home that day. Jason meticulously wrote it all down. Next came the neighbors. A few nearby homes had security cameras overlooking the lake path. It took patience, knocking on doors, explaining the situation, but after enough conversations, Jason found 2 cameras that captured parts of what had happened. He reviewed the footage again and again. The video was grainy, but damning. 3 men in tactical-style clothing, private HOA enforcement patches clearly visible. No visible law enforcement insignia, no marked vehicle. And there, time-stamped and undeniable, one of the men forcefully throwing Ethan to the ground while another loomed close by. Jason saved the footage on multiple drives. Now it was time to call someone who could help. He reached out to Alan Cruz, a longtime friend and now a respected detective with the county sheriff's office. Jason had worked with him years ago during his evidence handling days. If anyone would see the truth here, it was Alan. When Alan answered, Jason's voice was calm but direct. Alan, these guys assaulted my son. They're not law enforcement. They had no authority to detain, let alone use force. Alan agreed to meet him in person. Later that evening, in Alan's small office, Jason played the footage. Alan leaned in, watching every frame. When the clip ended, he sat back slowly. That, he said, voice firm, is criminal impersonation, Jason, and assault of a minor. Relief and resolve surged through Jason's chest. Someone believed him, someone who could act. The next steps moved fast. Alan looped in the county prosecutor and arranged for the state attorney general's office to be briefed. Together, they began pulling records, digging into the so-called security company that Roger Brandt had contracted. The findings stunned even the seasoned investigators. The firm wasn't a legitimate security service at all. It was a shell company created just months earlier with no valid licensing on file. The supposed owner, a man named Carl Drayton, had a long list of fraud convictions and no certified security background. Worse still, payment records revealed that the men had been paid under the table. No background checks, no insurance, no accountability. The deeper the investigators dug, the clearer the picture became. Roger Brandt had knowingly hired this sham operation to intimidate residents and enforce his own version of power. Jason felt something shift for the first time since this nightmare had begun. Hope, real hope. The wheels of justice were finally turning. 2 weeks later, the tide finally turned. Just after sunrise, unmarked vehicles rolled into the quiet office complex, where the so-called private HOA enforcement company was registered. Deputies served warrants, securing computers, files, and equipment. Simultaneously, another team arrived at Roger Brandt's home. By early afternoon, camera crews had gathered at both locations. News helicopters hovered overhead. The story had broken wide open. Across every local news channel, the headline was impossible to miss. Breaking. Fake HOA police assault teen, HOA president, under investigation. Jason and Ethan sat side by side on the couch, eyes fixed on the screen. The footage was surreal. Roger Brandt being led out of his front door in handcuffs, stone-faced and silent. Moments later, scenes from the security company's office played, showing evidence being carried out in sealed boxes. All 3 of the so-called officers were arrested that same day. The charges were serious: criminal impersonation, assault of a minor, unlawful detention, and conspiracy. The news cycle exploded. By nightfall, the story had spread statewide. Outrage poured in from residents, parents, and lawmakers alike. Many expressed disbelief that such an abuse of power had been allowed to fester under the guise of HOA governance. But amidst the public anger, something powerful emerged: momentum for change. Within days, state legislators introduced a bill to impose strict limitations on private enforcement by homeowners associations, ensuring that no community would repeat the mistakes seen in Jason's neighborhood. The bill drew overwhelming bipartisan support. Through it all, Jason found himself unexpectedly at the center of the conversation. News outlets reached out for interviews. With Melissa's quiet encouragement, he agreed. If sharing their experience could protect other families, it was worth it. One crisp morning, Jason and Ethan appeared on a local morning show. Cameras captured them walking onto the set together. Ethan wore a simple collared shirt, his posture a little taller than it had been in weeks. When asked why he chose to speak publicly, Jason's voice was steady. "We're not the only family this could have happened to," he said, "but we can be the last." Ethan looked over at his dad and smiled, a small, genuine smile. For Jason, it meant everything. The boy who had once been afraid to leave the house now stood in front of the world, not as a victim, but as someone who had helped spark real change. In the days that followed, neighbors stopped Jason on the street, offering quiet thanks. Other parents spoke up for the first time, pushing for new leadership within the HOA. The culture of fear that had shadowed the community was finally lifting. For Jason, the fight had never been about headlines or personal victory. It was about his son, and about making sure no other child would face what Ethan had endured. Now, as the neighborhood slowly healed, one simple truth remained: when good people stand firm against injustice, even the strongest walls of power can come crashing down.